Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of the strangest chapters of medieval life, when people lived in genuine terror of starting the new year incorrectly. Imagine waking up on what you thought was New Year's Day, only to discover your neighbour was celebrating a completely different date. And both of you were convinced the other was inviting catastrophe. In medieval Europe, nobody could agree on when the year actually began, and this confusion, it was not just inconvenient, it was spiritually dangerous. Before we step into this fascinating world together, I would love it if you could take just a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a like on this video, but only if tonight's story truly resonates with you. And I am curious, where are you watching from right now? Are you tucked into bed in California, listening from a quiet room in London, or perhaps relaxing somewhere I've never imagined? Drop a comment below, I genuinely love hearing from you. Now dim those lights, let the room settle into comfortable darkness, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise, and let us drift together into the medieval world where time itself could not be trusted. So picture this. It is the year 1265, and you are a merchant in London. You have just signed an important contract on what you believe is January 15th, but your business partner insists the date is actually December 4th of the previous year. Who is right? Well, that depends entirely on which calendar system you follow. And here is where it gets truly strange. Both of you could be correct according to different authorities, yet both of you could also be dooming your souls by celebrating or not celebrating at the wrong time. For most of medieval history, Europe could not settle on a single date for New Year's Day. And this was not some minor clerical disagreement. This was a spiritual crisis that kept people awake at night, wondering if they had accidentally cursed themselves by marking the wrong day as the year's beginning. In England, for most of the medieval period, specifically from around the mid-12th century until 1752, New Year's Day was officially celebrated on March 25th. This was the Feast of the Annunciation, the day when the angel Gabriel appeared to Mary and told her she would bear the Son of God. The logic was beautifully symmetrical. If Christ was born on December 25th, then 9 months earlier on March 25th was when everything began. It made theological sense. Spring was arriving, nature was being reborn, and so too was the year itself. But here's the problem. If you travel to France during this same period, you might find people celebrating New Year on Easter Sunday. Except Easter moves every year based on the lunar calendar, so the French New Year could fall anywhere between late March and late April, shifting unpredictably. One year you might celebrate New Year on April 15th, and the next year on March 28th. Imagine trying to schedule your life around that kind of uncertainty. Meanwhile, if you sailed to Venice, the Venetians had decided March 1st was the proper beginning of the year. In some parts of Spain and Portugal, people celebrated on December 25th. Christmas itself was their new year. And then there was the old Roman tradition, still stubbornly persisting in certain regions, that insisted January 1st was the correct date, because that is when Roman consuls traditionally took office under Julius Caesar's calendar from 46 BC. The Church found itself in an impossible position. On one hand, January 1st had been the Roman New Year for centuries, tied to the pagan god Janus, a two-faced deity who looked backward at the old year and forward to the new. The symbolism was powerful, but it was also deeply pagan, and the medieval church was obsessed with stamping out anything that smelled of paganism. In 57 AD, the Council of Tours, a gathering of church bishops, made a dramatic decision. They officially condemned the celebration of January 1st as New Year's Day. Why? Because the festivities associated with the Roman calends of January were far too pagan, far too wild, far too connected to the old gods. The bishops declared that Christians should absolutely not participate in these celebrations. They were demonic, dangerous, soul-threatening. But did people listen? Not entirely. And that is where the fear crept in, because now regular people were caught in a terrible bind. If you celebrated January 1st, you were potentially engaging in pagan ritual and inviting demons into your life. But if you ignored it, you might be missing the actual turning of the year, which could be equally dangerous. And if your neighbour celebrated March 25th while you celebrated Easter Sunday, who was right? Who was safe? Who had accidentally started their year at the wrong moment and was now doomed to 12 months of misfortune? Medieval chroniclers, the people tasked with recording history, faced nightmares because of this confusion. Imagine trying to write down when a king was crowned, when a battle occurred, or when a treaty was signed, but different regions used different New Year dates. A chronicler in England might record that an event happened in 1250, while a French chronicler would insist the exact same event occurred in 1249, and a Venetian would argue it was actually early 1251. Who was telling the truth? Everyone. No one. History itself became slippery and uncertain. There are documented cases of legal disputes that arose specifically because of calendar confusion. A merchant might claim a debt was due by the end of the year, but which year? The one that ends on March 24th, December 24th, December 31st? Contracts became minefields of potential misunderstanding, and people genuinely believed that dating a document incorrectly could invalidate not just the legal agreement, but also bring bad luck upon everyone involved. And underneath all this practical chaos was something darker, genuine spiritual anxiety. Medieval people believed that time was not just a human measurement, it was cosmic, divine, woven into the fabric of God's creation. The year's turning was a sacred moment, a threshold between the old and the new, a time when the veil between the earthly and spiritual worlds grew thin. Starting the year at the wrong moment was not like missing an appointment. It was like opening a door at the wrong time and not knowing what might step through. Think about what this meant for ordinary people. A farmer needed to know when to plant crops, but if he followed the wrong new year, would his harvest fail? A woman preparing to marry needed to schedule her wedding for an auspicious time, but which calendar should she trust? A pregnant mother worried, if her child was born at the wrong new year, would the baby be cursed from birth? The anxiety this created was profound. People lived with the constant fear that they might be celebrating at the wrong moment, praying on the wrong day, making decisions when the cosmic calendar said they should wait. And because different authorities, the church, local traditions, regional customs, all contradicted each other, there was no way to be certain you were doing it right. Some historians believe this calendar chaos actually deepened medieval superstition rather than reducing it. When official authorities could not agree on something as fundamental as when the year began, people turned to folk wisdom, to local omens, to their grandmother's warnings. If the bishops could not settle the question, maybe the behaviour of animals could. Maybe the weather, maybe dreams, maybe the ancient traditions that predated Christianity itself. And here is what makes this particularly fascinating. The confusion did not end in the Middle Ages. England did not officially adopt January 1st as New Year's Day until 1752, when the country finally switched to the Gregorian calendar. That means for centuries after the medieval period ended, English people were still celebrating the New Year in late March while the rest of Europe had moved on. Imagine the confusion for travellers, for merchants, for anyone doing business across borders. But in the medieval period, this uncertainty created a culture of fear around transitions. If you could not trust when the year began, how could you trust anything about time? How could you plan? How could you feel aware? The inability to agree on New Year's Day became a symbol of a larger medieval anxiety, that the world was fundamentally uncertain, that danger lurked at every threshold, and that one wrong step, one wrong day, could unravel everything. People coped by creating elaborate superstitions, rituals designed to protect themselves no matter which date was correct. They would perform cleansing rituals in late December, again on New Year's Day wherever they celebrated it, and sometimes again in late March just to be safe. They would avoid making major decisions during the entire winter period, from December through March, because who knew which day might actually be the cosmic turning point? And perhaps most tellingly, they would judge the success of their New Year celebration retroactively. If the following months went well, crops grew, no one died, business prospered, then they had clearly celebrated on the right day. But if disaster struck, well, then they must have gotten it wrong. They had started the year at the wrong moment, and now they were paying the price. This is the world we are stepping into tonight. A world where something as simple as agreeing on a date became impossible, where that impossibility bred genuine terror, and where people lived with the constant fear that they might have accidentally, innocently, started their year in a way that invited catastrophe. The medieval calendar was not just confused, it was a source of deep existential anxiety. And the beliefs that grew from this confusion, they were darker and stranger than most of us can imagine. But the calendar chaos was only the beginning, because even when people thought they knew which day was New Year, there was still the matter of the calends, those wild, dangerous celebrations that the church condemned but could never quite stamp out. And those festivities, they contained their own set of terrors, their own beliefs about what happened when you celebrated the new year in the wrong way. That is where our journey takes us next, into the firelit streets of medieval cities, where people danced and drank and risked their very souls at the turning of the year, the Roman calends of January. Even the name sounds ancient, does it not? Like something whispered in stone corridors by people who lived so long ago that their fears should mean nothing to us now. But those fears persisted. They haunted medieval Europe for centuries, long after Rome fell, long after Christianity supposedly conquered paganism. And the reason they persisted? Because the celebrations were absolutely irresistible. Let me take you to a medieval city on the night of December 31st. The year does not matter. Pick any century between 800 and 1500, and the scene would be remarkably similar. As darkness falls, you begin to hear it. Music, laughter, shouting. The streets are filling with people, and they are doing things that would normally get them arrested, excommunicated, or worse. Men are dressed as women. Women are dressed as men. A baker is wearing a bishop's mitre made of paper, carrying a wooden staff, pretending to bless the crowd with slurred words and exaggerated gestures. A servant has put on his master's finest coat and is strutting through the town square, mocking the way wealthy people walk. Someone has fashioned a mask of a demon, horns, wild eyes, a lolling tongue, and is chasing children who shriek with delighted terror. This is the Feast of Fools, the medieval descendant of the Roman calends, and the church absolutely hated it. But before we understand why the church was so terrified of these celebrations, we need to understand what the calends actually was. In ancient Rome, the calends of January 1st, mark the beginning of the civil year. It was when Roman consuls took office, when debts were calculated, when the political machinery of the empire reset itself. But it was also a festival dedicated to Janus, that strange two-faced god who could look simultaneously at the past and future. The Romans celebrated with gift-giving, particularly gifts of honey and sweet treats, symbolizing the hope for a sweet year ahead. They decorated their homes with laurel branches, they visited friends, they made sacrifices to Janus at his temple, and most importantly, they engaged in what we might call ritual reversal. Slaves were allowed to speak freely to their masters, children could be cheeky to parents. The social order was temporarily, deliciously upended. Now fast forward several centuries. Rome has fallen, Christianity has spread across Europe, pagan gods are supposedly vanquished. But on January 1st, year after year, century after century, people keep celebrating the calends. They cannot seem to stop, and this drove church authorities absolutely mad. Starting in the 6th century, we have letters, furious, desperate letters, from bishops and church councils begging, demanding, threatening people to stop these celebrations. In 570, the Council of Tours, the same one that tried to move New Year away from January 1st, specifically condemned calend celebrations as demonic. Bishop Caesarius of Arles wrote passionate sermons calling participants slaves of the devil. Another bishop described the calends as a time when Satan himself walked the streets, entering the bodies of revelers. The problem was that the celebrations felt harmless. They were fun. After the hard work of harvest season, after the darkness of December, people craved release. They wanted to laugh, to drink, to temporarily escape the rigid hierarchies of medieval life, and the calends gave them permission. By the High Middle Ages, the celebration had evolved into something called the Feast of Fools, and it was celebrated throughout France, England, and parts of Germany, usually on January 1st or during the days between Christmas and Epiphany, and it was absolutely wild. Imagine walking into a church, a sacred space where silence and reverence are usually mandatory, and finding junior clergy members conducting a mock mass. They are wearing vestments backwards. They are singing hymns with obscene lyrics substituted for the holy words. Instead of incense, they are burning old shoes and leather scraps, filling the cathedral with foul smoke. They elect a boy bishop or pope of fools, often choosing the most junior, most disrespected member of the clergy, and for one day he holds absolute authority. He can command actual bishops to serve him. He can make ridiculous pronouncements. He can turn the entire church hierarchy upside down. Outside the church, the festivities were even more chaotic. People wore animal masks, particularly donkeys, which had special significance because of the donkey that carried Mary to Bethlehem and later carried the Holy Family to Egypt. There would be a Feast of the Ass, where an actual donkey was brought into the church, and the congregation would bray like donkeys instead of saying Amen. Does this sound blasphemous to you? It absolutely sounded blasphemous to medieval bishops. But here is the fascinating part. Many lower clergy members loved it. For them, this was the one day a year when they could mock the pompous archbishops, when they could point out hypocrisies, when they could be human instead of holy. And the common people? They thought it was necessary. Many genuinely believed that if you did not engage in some form of celebration at the year's turning, you were inviting bad luck. The old Roman belief that you had to mark the calends properly or face consequences had seeped so deeply into folk culture that people could not shake it, even after 1,000 years of Christianity. But the church authorities were not wrong to be worried, because intertwined with the festivities was something genuinely dark. The belief that the calends was the time when demons were particularly active. Medieval theologians taught that demons were always looking for opportunities to enter the human world, and times of transition, doorways, thresholds, the turning of the year, were when the barriers between worlds grew thin. The calends, they argued, was the most dangerous threshold of all. It was a seam in time, a crack in the cosmic order, and when people celebrated it, especially in these wild pagan ways, they were essentially throwing open the door and inviting demons in. There are documented cases of priests warning their congregations that anyone who participated in calends festivities would be possessed. Not might be possessed, would be. They described the demons of the calends as particularly cunning, entering through laughter, through drunkenness, through the temporary madness of celebration. Once inside a person, these demons would remain for the entire year, causing illness, bad luck, crop failures, even death. A 12th century penitential manual, a handbook priests used to assign penances for sins, lists specific punishments for Kalen's participation. If you dressed as an animal, you owed 40 days of fasting. If you dressed as the opposite sex, 60 days. If you participated in a mock religious ceremony, an entire year of penance. The church was not playing around, but people kept celebrating anyway. Why? Partly because it was fun, yes, but also because they were caught in an impossible superstition. The old pagan belief said you must celebrate the Kalends or face bad luck. The Christian belief said you must not celebrate it or face demonic possession. So what do you do when both celebrating and not celebrating seem equally dangerous? Many people tried to split the difference. They would attend church in the morning, properly solemn, properly Christian. Then at night, they would put on masks and join the revelry, perhaps convincing themselves that the mask made it not really them, that the devil could not identify their souls if their faces were hidden. It was magical thinking, but when you are terrified of starting the year wrong, magical thinking feels safer than doing nothing. There are recorded instances of entire communities being divided over the Kalends. In one French town in the 14th century, the bishop threatened to excommunicate anyone who participated in the Feast of Fools. Half the town obeyed, staying home in fearful prayer. The other half celebrated anyway. Then, when a terrible storm destroyed much of the harvest that summer, both groups blamed each other. The ones who celebrated said the pious people had failed to properly mark the year's turning, angering the old spirits of the land. The ones who stayed home said the celebrants had invited demons who now plagued the entire community. The town nearly tore itself apart. And this is what made the Kalends' beliefs so insidious. They put people in a state of perpetual anxiety. No matter what you chose, you could be wrong, and if anything bad happened in the coming year, and something always happens, you would wonder, was it because I celebrated, or because I did not? The church fought the Feast of Fools for centuries. They issued decree after decree, they threatened, they punished. Slowly, very slowly, the celebration lost its most extreme elements. By the 16th century, the mock religious ceremonies had mostly stopped, but the folk celebrations continued in various forms, and the underlying fear that you had to mark the new year properly or face spiritual consequences never really went away. Even as late as the 1500s, Protestant reformers were still complaining about Kalen's traditions. They found it infuriating that people who considered themselves good Christians would still, on January 1st, engage in practices that were obviously pagan in origin, but the people could not help themselves. The belief was too deep, too old, too connected to something primal about human fear of time passing and years turning. Here is what I find most fascinating. The church's opposition to the Kalends may have actually made the superstition stronger. When authority figures tell you something is dangerous, forbidden, connected to demons, it does not always make you stop. At times it makes the act feel more powerful, more significant. If celebrating the Kalends could actually attract demons, then maybe, just maybe, it could also attract other supernatural forces. Maybe properly marking the moment could bring luck, protection, blessings, so people kept their rituals, kept their celebrations, but now they were layered with anxiety. What had been joyful Roman gift-giving became medieval people exchanging presents while wondering if they were damning themselves. What had been playful role reversal became cross-dressing that might invite demonic possession. The fun was still there, but underneath it, always, was fear. And this is what medieval New Year beliefs were really about. They were not just superstitions, they were attempts to navigate an impossible situation where both action and inaction felt dangerous, where the church said one thing but ancient tradition said another, where starting the year right seemed crucial but nobody could agree on what right meant. The calends lingered in European consciousness for over 1,000 years after Rome fell. That is an astonishing length of time for a belief system to persist, despite constant opposition from the most powerful institution in medieval life. It tells us something profound about human psychology, that our fears about transitions, about thresholds, about the turning of time run deeper than any theology can reach. But if the calends was about communal celebration gone potentially dangerous, there was another New Year belief that was even more personal, even more terrifying. Because this one involved not what you did in the streets, but who crossed your threshold first. This superstition did not care about your celebrations or your prayers. It cared about something much simpler and much more impossible to control. The first person to enter your home after midnight. And if you got that wrong, well, that is where our journey takes us next, into the homes of medieval Scotland and England, where families waited in desperate hope that the right person, and only the right person, would knock on their door first. There is something deeply primal about doorways, is there not? That moment when you cross from outside to inside, when you move from one space to another. Every culture throughout history has treated thresholds as magical places, dangerous places, places where ordinary rules do not quite apply. And in medieval Scotland and northern England, there was no threshold more important, more laden with supernatural significance than the one crossed at the stroke of midnight on New Year's Eve. They called it first footing, and families would literally plan for weeks to ensure they got it right. Imagine you are in a Scottish village in the year 1450. It is December 31st, and the entire household is tense with anticipation. Not the excited kind of tension, the anxious kind. Because in a few hours, when midnight strikes, the first person to cross your threshold will determine your family's fate for the entire coming year. Prosperity or poverty, health or illness, life or death. All of it hanging on who knocks at your door first. And here is the terrifying part. You cannot completely control it. The ideal first footer, according to Scottish tradition, had to meet very specific criteria. He had to be male. That was non-negotiable. He had to be tall. Short men were considered less auspicious, though nobody could quite explain why. And most importantly, most critically, he had to have dark hair. Dark hair! That detail is crucial, and the reason why tells us everything about how medieval superstitions were born from historical trauma. Scotland, you see, spent centuries being raided by Vikings. From the late 8th century through the 11th century, Norse invaders would arrive on Scottish shores with alarming regularity. And Vikings, as you might imagine, tended to have blonde or light-coloured hair. So when a tall, blonde stranger appeared at your door in medieval Scotland, it was rarely good news. More likely it meant violence, theft, your home being burned, your family killed or enslaved. This terror became encoded in Scottish folk belief. Light-haired strangers became synonymous with disaster. And when those beliefs merged with the superstition surrounding New Year, that liminal, threshold moment when the fabric of fate was supposedly being woven, the result was first footing. A dark-haired man meant safety, meant your ancestors, meant people who belonged to the land. A blonde stranger meant invasion, meant disruption, meant everything going terribly wrong. But it gets more specific and stranger. The first footer could not be someone who was already in the house when midnight struck. That was cheating, and fate knew when you were cheating. No, the first footer had to genuinely come from outside, crossing the threshold as a symbolic representation of the new year entering your home. So families developed elaborate strategies. They would identify a suitable candidate, ideally a tall, dark-haired male relative or friend, and that person would agree to be the designated first footer. At about 5 minutes before midnight, this chosen individual would leave the house, stepping out into the cold December night. Then, as the bells rang midnight, He would knock on the door and be invited back in, now officially as the first footer, the first person to cross the threshold in the new year, and he could not arrive empty-handed. Oh no! The gifts he brought were laden with symbolism, each one representing something the household needed for the coming year. Coal was essential. A lump of coal represented warmth, the ability to keep your fire burning through the harsh remainder of winter. In a time when freezing to death was a genuine possibility, when many elderly people and children did not survive until spring, coal was not just practical, it was survival itself. The first footer bringing coal was saying symbolically, "Your hearth will not go cold, your family will not freeze." Salt came next, and salt in medieval Scotland was precious, expensive, absolutely necessary for preserving food. Meat would rot without it, fish would spoil, vegetables would mould. Salt meant the difference between eating and starving when winter stretched long and spring came late. So when the first footer brought salt, he was bringing the promise of preservation, of sustenance, of making it through until the next harvest. Then there was shortbread or black bun, a dense, dark fruit cake wrapped in pastry. Food, directly, literally, the promise that you would have enough to eat. Black bun was particularly significant because it took considerable resources to make. Dried fruits that had to be imported, spices that cost money, pastry that required good flour and butter. A first footer bringing black bun was essentially bringing proof of abundance. And finally, whiskey. Because what is life without some joy, some warmth in your chair, some liquid courage against the darkness? The whiskey represented good cheer, celebration, the ability to mark moments with something more than just survival. It was hope in a bottle. Now here is where it gets psychologically fascinating. If your first footer was wrong, if a woman knocked first, if a red-haired man appeared, if a short person crossed your threshold before anyone else, the belief was that your entire year was now cursed. And medieval people took this seriously, genuinely, devastatingly seriously. There are documented accounts of families refusing to open their doors if the wrong person knocked first. Can you imagine that? Midnight has struck, you hear a knock. You peek through the window and see a red-haired woman standing there with a basket of food. She is probably a neighbour, probably means well. But you do not open the door. You cannot. Because if she crosses your threshold first, your children might die this year. Your crops will fail. Disease will come. You wait, heart pounding, praying that someone else, the right someone, will arrive soon. Sometimes households got desperate. If dawn broke and no suitable first footer had appeared, families would remain barricaded inside their own homes, too terrified to step outside themselves. Because you could not leave your house before the first footer arrived, or you would carry your bad luck outside with you and spread it through the village. Imagine being trapped inside your own home by superstition, staring at the door, waiting while time ticks by and the year grows older by the hour. And if tragedy struck during the year, and tragedy always struck someone, because life in medieval Scotland was brutally hard, people would remember. They would trace it back. Remember who our first footer was, remember? It was Jean's cousin, the one with sandy-coloured hair, not properly dark. That is why the fever took the baby. That is why the cow went dry. That is why father broke his leg, we knew. We knew at midnight it would be a cursed year. The guilt this placed on individuals who accidentally became the wrong first footer must have been immense. Imagine you are a red-haired woman in a medieval Scottish village. It is just past midnight on New Year's Day, and you're walking home from a friend's house. You knock on your own door, expecting your family to let you in. Instead, you see their faces through the window. Horror, disappointment, barely concealed anger. Because you have just cursed them, your own family, for an entire year. Some communities tried to control for this by having the designated first footer patrol the streets near midnight. essentially guarding their neighbours' homes, making sure he would be the first to knock on every door in the village. He would go house to house, bringing his coal and salt and whiskey, ensuring that every family started the year correctly. It was an act of community service, yes, but also an act of community survival. If one household started the year wrong and fell into misfortune, their bad luck could spread. Their crops could infect yours with blight. Their illness could become your illness. Their demons could become your demons. And speaking of demons, because there were always demons in medieval belief, the threshold itself was considered a supernaturally dangerous place. It was neither inside nor outside, neither here nor there. Demons and malevolent spirits were believed to lurk at thresholds, waiting for moments of transition to slip through. The turning of the year was the ultimate transition, and your front door was the ultimate threshold. So the first person to cross that threshold at that specific moment was not just bringing luck or bad luck. They were, in a sense, breaking a seal. They were the first thing to move from the outside world into your protected space in the new year. If they were strong, pure, auspicious, a tall, dark-haired man bearing gifts, they broke that seal safely and entered carrying protection. But if they were inauspicious, then what slipped through with them might not be human at all. There is a particularly dark version of the superstition that specifically forbade women from being first-footers, not just because of practical considerations, but because of the Cailleach. Have you heard of her? She was the ancient Scottish winter goddess, the crone, the hag of winter who brought storms and death and cold. She was depicted as an old woman, gaunt and terrible, carrying a staff made of ice. And the fear was that if an old woman knocked on your door first on New Year's Day, it might not actually be your neighbour. It might be the Cailleach herself, come to claim your household for winter's domain. Superstition or not, the emotional reality was real. Families sat in their homes after midnight listening to every sound outside, trying to identify footsteps, holding their breath when they heard someone approaching. Was it Malcolm from next door, dark-haired and reliable, bringing his coal and shortbread? Or was it someone else, someone wrong, someone dangerous? And the cruelty of this superstition was that it made people paranoid about their own neighbours and family. It created hierarchies even among loved ones. Brothers with different hair colours were not equal on New Year's Eve. The dark-haired brother was blessed, valuable, needed. The blonde brother was potentially dangerous, someone to be kept away from thresholds at midnight. How must that have felt? To know that your own family feared your presence at the year's turning? Yet the tradition persisted for centuries. It persists, in modified form, even today in parts of Scotland. People still talk about first footing, still arrange for tall, dark-haired friends to knock on their doors at midnight, though now it is more about keeping a charming tradition alive than genuine fear. But the fact that the tradition survived at all tells us something about how deeply the medieval terror of starting the year wrong was embedded in cultural consciousness. Because at the core of first footing was a belief that most of us still harbour, even if we do not admit it, that beginnings matter, that how something starts influences how it continues, that there are moments in time when the future is malleable, when fate can be nudged one direction or another, and that we have to be so careful in those moments, or everything will go wrong. Medieval Scots did not have control over much. They could not control the weather, the crops, whether disease would come, whether English raiders or Highland feuds would destroy their homes. But they could control, or try to control, who crossed their threshold first on New Year's Day. It was a tiny island of agency in a sea of chaos, and they clung to it with desperate intensity. The first footer brought more than coal and whiskey. He brought the illusion of control, the promise that if you just performed this one ritual correctly, if you just got this one thing right, maybe, The universe would be kind to you for the next 12 months. But here is the unsettling question. What if you did everything right? What if your first footer was perfect, tall, dark-haired, bringing all the proper gifts and disaster struck anyway? What then? Well, then you started looking for other things you might have done wrong. Other ways you might have started the year incorrectly. Other superstitions you might have violated. And there were so many ways to curse your new year without even realizing it. Ways that had nothing to do with who crossed your threshold, but everything to do with what you did, what you said, what you touched in those critical first hours of January. Those beliefs were darker, more complex, and they turned the entire beginning of the year into a minefield of potential mistakes. That is where we need to venture next, into the granular, obsessive details of medieval New Year taboos, where even the direction you stirred your porridge could determine whether your family would survive until spring. Picture a medieval woman waking up on the morning she believes is New Year's Day, her eyes open in the pre-dawn darkness. For a moment she lies completely still, barely breathing, because the next few seconds will determine everything. Which foot will touch the floor first? Which direction will she face when she stands? What will be the first words that leave her lips? Get any of these wrong and the entire year is cursed before breakfast even begins. This is the reality of medieval New Year beliefs at their most granular, most obsessive, most psychologically exhausting level. We have talked about the big superstitions, the calendar confusion, the calend celebrations, the first footer at your door. But underneath those major fears lived hundreds of smaller terrors, micro-superstitions that turn the first days of the new year into an obstacle course of potential disaster. And the strangest part, many of these beliefs had nothing to do with Christianity. They were older, much older, remnants of beliefs that stretched back into pagan antiquity but had never quite died. The church could condemn them. Theologians could mock them, but people kept following these rules with religious fervour because the alternative, risking bad luck for an entire year, was simply too terrifying. Let us start with something that sounds almost absurd until you realise how seriously people took it: the direction you moved. In medieval belief there was a correct direction for movement, sunwise or clockwise following the path of the sun across the sky. This was called deozel in Celtic tradition. Moving in this direction was natural, proper, aligned with the cosmos, but moving the opposite direction, that was widdershins, and it was dangerous. Now you might think this only applied to big rituals, important ceremonies, but no. Medieval people, especially in Scotland, Ireland and the Celtic-influenced parts of England, believed that the stirring your porridge widdershins on New Year's morning could cause it to spoil. Worse, it could cause everything you cooked that entire year to turn out badly. Imagine believing that the direction you stirred your breakfast could determine whether your family would have palatable food for the next 12 months. A monk writing in the 14th century recorded a story, half in disgust, half in fascination, about a woman who had stirred her pot counterclockwise on January 1st. When her bread repeatedly failed to rise that year, when her ale went sour, when her preserved meat developed mould, the entire village blamed that single moment of widdershin stirring. The woman herself apparently believed it, spending the rest of the year in a state of anxious guilt, convinced she had cursed her household's food supply. But it was not just about stirring. Walking around a building widdershins could bring bad luck. Handing someone an object by passing it counterclockwise around a table was considered ill-omened. Some people would not even turn their heads to the left on New Year's morning, insisting on only turning right, always following the sun's path. Can you imagine the mental energy this required? To be constantly aware of which direction you were moving, which way you were turning, which direction your hand was travelling when you passed the salt. And this was just one category of superstition among dozens. Then there were the animals, medieval almanacs, printed guides that literate people consulted for farming advice, weather predictions, and yes, superstitions listed specific animals that, if encountered first thing on New Year's Day, would determine your fortune. Meeting a hare was considered lucky, especially if the hare was running away from you. The reasoning was beautifully poetic. Hares were associated with spring, with fertility, with new life. Seeing one as the year began meant that life would flourish. But meeting an ass, a donkey, was catastrophic. One medieval text explains that donkeys, being stubborn and slow, represented obstinacy and impediments. If a donkey was the first animal you saw on New Year's Day, you would face obstacles and frustrations for the next 12 months. People who owned donkeys would sometimes keep them locked in the barn on New Year's morning, terrified that a family member might accidentally glimpse one through a window. Ravens and crows were equally ominous. These black birds, associated with death and battlefields because they were carrion eaters, gathering where men had died, were considered harbingers of doom. If you heard a raven's croak as the first sound on New Year's morning, the superstition held that someone in your household would die before the year ended. There is a heartbreaking account from a 15th century English chronicle about a mother who heard a raven outside her window on New Year's dawn. She apparently spent the entire year in a state of terrified anticipation, watching her children obsessively, interpreting every cough and fever as the fulfillment of the omen. When her youngest son died in October from a fall, a tragic accident, but common in medieval life, she was simultaneously devastated and grimly unsurprised. The raven had foretold it, she said. The raven knew. This is the psychological torture of these superstitions. They turned people into prophets of their own doom, constantly looking for signs that their fears would be realized, unable to simply live because they were trapped in a web of omens and predictions. Weather on New Year's Day was another source of obsessive interpretation. Thunder in January was particularly significant and particularly feared. There was a widespread belief, documented in multiple medieval texts, that thunder in January predicted a year of strong winds, abundant crops, and much bloodshed. That last part is crucial. Bloodshed. Thunder was associated with divine anger, with violence, with war. So if you heard thunder on New Year's Day, you did not just worry about storms, you worried that armies would march, that raiders would come, and that blood would soak into the earth. In an era when war was common, when Viking raids, Norman invasions, Scottish border conflicts, and the 100 Years' War made violence a constant presence, this superstition had real psychological weight. Hearing thunder on New Year's Day meant spending the year waiting for war to arrive at your doorstep. Frost patterns were read like texts. If frost formed in certain shapes on your windows on New Year's morning, it could predict the year ahead. Frost that looked like wheat stalks meant good harvests. Frost that formed jagged, irregular patterns meant a difficult, chaotic year. Some people would refuse to wipe frost from their windows on New Year's Day, leaving it until it melted naturally, afraid that destroying the pattern would destroy their luck along with it. And then there were the words. The first words spoken in the new year had immense power. If you woke up and the first thing you said was a curse, even something mild, even just an expression of frustration, you risk cursing your entire year. Some families enforced absolute silence on New Year's morning until someone could say something properly auspicious. Children were trained from a young age. When you wake up on New Year's Day, you say a prayer first. You thank God. You speak only blessings until the sun is properly up. But what if you had a nightmare? What if you woke from a terrible dream, frightened and cried out before you could stop yourself? Some medieval people believed that nightmares on New Year's Eve were actually demonic attacks, attempts by malevolent spirits to make you curse yourself with your own first words of the year. There are prayer books from the medieval period that include special supplications to be said on New Year's Eve, specifically asking for protection from evil dreams and for the grace to wake with holy words on your lips. This was not considered unusual or excessive. This was standard spiritual hygiene for the year's most dangerous transition. The first object you touched could also determine your luck. There was a superstition that if the first thing you touched on New Year's Day was iron, you would be protected from evil all year. Iron was believed to repel fairies, demons, and malevolent magic, so some people would sleep with an iron nail under their pillow, ensuring that when they reached out in the darkness upon waking, their hand would find iron first. Others believed that touching silver first brought wealth. There are accounts of people placing a silver coin on their nightstand, positioned precisely so it would be the first thing their hand encountered. The symbolism was straightforward. Begin the year touching wealth, and wealth will follow you. But what if you were poor and had no silver? Then you worried that your poverty was being reinforced, cursed into permanence by the absence of that symbolic touch. The superstition did not just promise good luck to those who could afford silver. It implicitly confirmed bad luck for those who could not. This is one of the cruelest aspects of these beliefs. They gave the wealthy more ways to feel secure and gave the poor more reasons to feel doomed. Even something as simple as which direction you faced when you woke up mattered to some people. You were supposed to face east when you rose on New Year's morning, toward the rising sun, toward Jerusalem, toward Christ, toward all things holy and hopeful. Facing west was inauspicious because west was where the sun died each day, where darkness came from, where souls went when they left the living world. But how could you control which direction you faced when you woke up? You could position your bed carefully, but you might turn in your sleep. You might wake facing the wrong direction and not realize it until too late. And then you would spend the entire year wondering if some misfortune was caused by that unconscious error. The accumulation of these micro-superstitions created a state of perpetual anxiety that is difficult for modern people to fully grasp. Imagine starting every year knowing that hundreds of tiny details, most of which you could not fully control, would determine your fate for the next 12 months. Imagine the mental checklist you would have to maintain. Correct foot first, face east, touch iron, stir clockwise, say a prayer, watch for the right animals, listen for ravens, check the frost, speak no curses, move sunwise, do not turn left, wait for the dark-haired first footer. One mistake, one moment of forgetfulness, one instance of bad timing, and you had potentially cursed yourself. And here is the truly insidious part. If anything bad happened during the year, and something bad always happened, you could trace it back. You could convince yourself that you remembered waking up and maybe your right foot touched the floor first when it should have been your left. Or was it supposed to be right? Wait, which foot was lucky? Now you could not remember, and that uncertainty itself became a source of anxiety. Medieval New Year superstitions created a self-fulfilling psychological trap. The beliefs generated so much stress that people were primed to interpret everything negatively. And when you're looking for evidence that you started the year wrong, you will find it. That is just how human psychology works. But underneath all this anxiety was something touchingly human. The desperate desire to believe that we have some control over our fates. Medieval people lived with so much uncertainty, so much vulnerability. They could not control when plague would come, when harvests would fail, when war would arrive, but they could control or try to control these tiny rituals. They could be careful about stirring direction, watchful of animals, deliberate with their words. It was an illusion of control, yes, but sometimes an illusion is all you have. The medieval church had complicated feelings about these micro-superstitions. On one hand, theologians condemned them as pagan nonsense, as evidence that people had not truly accepted Christian teaching. Augustine had written in the 5th century that reading omens was foolish and potentially sinful because it suggested that random natural events had divine significance, which implied that God could be read like a book of signs rather than approached through prayer and scripture. But on the other hand, the Church used similar logic in its own teachings. Was it really so different to say that seeing a raven predicted death versus saying that not attending Mass invited divine punishment? Both were attempts to find meaningful patterns in the relationship between action and consequence to believe that the universe responded to human behaviour. So the Church's condemnation was half-hearted, inconsistent. Some priests railed against these superstitions in sermons. Others quietly followed the same beliefs themselves, perhaps touching iron when they woke on New Year's Day, perhaps feeling a flutter of anxiety when they heard thunder in January. These micro-superstitions persisted for centuries, some of them lasting well into the modern era. Even today you can find elderly people in rural Scotland and Ireland who remember being told as children not to stir widdershins on New Year's Day, not to turn left when you could turn right, to be careful of the first words you speak. The beliefs have lost most of their terror, become quaint traditions, amusing superstitions that people follow with a wink and a laugh. But in the medieval period, they were not amusing. They were genuinely frightening, sources of real psychological distress, and we've barely scratched the surface. Because beyond all these individual taboos was one overarching belief that terrified medieval people more than almost anything else. Certain days themselves were cursed. Not just unlucky, actually cosmically, spiritually cursed. The Church tried to bless every day, dedicating each one to saints, attempting to sanctify the entire calendar. But some days resisted blessing. Some days remained dark. Medieval people called them the evil days, and if you understood nothing else about medieval New Year beliefs, you had to understand this. There were specific days when you simply did not begin anything new, or you invited not just bad luck, but spiritual catastrophe. Those beliefs transformed the medieval calendar into a map of danger zones, and that is the dark territory we need to explore next. If you could read in medieval Europe, and most people could not, one of the most valuable books you might own was an almanac. These were printed guides that told you when to plant crops, when to expect rain, when certain saints' days fell. But they also contained something darker. Lists of dies mali, the evil days. Days when the fabric of reality was somehow thinner, more dangerous. Days when beginning any new venture was not just unwise but spiritually catastrophic. And 3 specific Mondays were considered the most cursed days of the entire year. The first Monday in April, the second Monday in August, and the last Monday in December. These 3 Mondays were so feared that people would refuse to travel on them, refuse to marry, refuse to start new jobs, refuse even to undergo medical treatment. Better to die untreated than to begin your healing journey on an evil Monday and ensure your death anyway. Why these specific Mondays? The origins are murky, lost in that tangled place where pagan tradition meets early Christianity meets folk superstition. But the belief was documented across medieval Europe, particularly in England, France and Germany. And it persisted stubbornly, powerfully for centuries. Medieval almanacs would print these dates in red ink or with special symbols. Some included stern warnings in Latin, meant to be read by priests who would then warn their congregations. On these days, 1st century almanac reads, "Let no man begin a journey from which he wishes to return, nor let him take medicine, nor let him undertake any work of importance, lest evil befall him." Think about what this meant practically. You are a medieval merchant planning a trading journey. You need to leave in early April to reach the spring fairs where you will buy and sell goods that will sustain your family for the year. But the first Monday in April is an evil day. Do you leave on Tuesday instead, arriving late when the best goods are already sold? Do you risk leaving on the cursed Monday, hoping the superstition is nonsense? Or do you postpone the entire journey, potentially losing the year's best trading opportunity because you're too afraid? There are actual records of merchants making this exact calculation. A 14th century account book from a German trader includes a note explaining why certain shipments were delayed. The evil Monday fell upon our departure date and no man would sail with me, and so we waited 3 days and missed the favourable winds. The man lost money because of a superstition, but to him and his crew, that financial loss was preferable to the spiritual danger of travelling on a cursed day. Better to be poor than cursed. Medical treatment on evil days was particularly feared. Medieval medicine was already terrifying enough: bloodletting, trepanning, cauterization with hot irons, treatments based on balancing humours that often made patients worse instead of better. But beginning medical treatment on an evil day was believed to guarantee death. A heartbreaking account from a 12th century monastic chronicle tells of a monk who fell gravely ill on the Sunday before the first Monday in April. The monastery's infirmarian, their medical practitioner, examined him and determined he needed bloodletting urgently. But the next day was an evil Monday, so they waited. The monk's condition worsened through Monday, and he finally received treatment on Tuesday. He died Wednesday. The chronicle's author notes, with a mixture of sorrow and grim satisfaction, that they had at least given him the chance to survive by not treating him on the cursed day. The fact that waiting likely hastened his death was apparently less important than avoiding the evil Monday. How do you process that? They let a man suffer, possibly die, because they were more afraid of breaking a superstition than of the disease itself. Marriages were absolutely forbidden on evil Mondays. The medieval church already had a complex calendar of when marriages could and could not occur. You could not marry during Lent, during Advent, on Fridays, on certain saints' days. But evil Mondays were even more strictly avoided. A marriage begun on an evil Monday was believed to be cursed from the start. Infidelity, infertility, early death of one or both partners, children born sickly or cursed. No priest would perform the ceremony, and no couple would request it. There is a recorded case from 15th century England where a couple had scheduled their wedding for early April, not realising it fell on the first Monday. When they discovered the date was cursed, they tried to postpone, but the bride's father had already paid for the feast, invited guests, made arrangements. The financial loss would be significant, yet he agreed to postpone anyway, pushing the wedding back an entire week. The fear was that powerful. But here is where it gets psychologically complex. What if something bad happened to you on a Tuesday, but you had travelled the previous Monday? An ordinary Monday, not one of the evil ones. Some people would still wonder. They would count back the days, calculating whether they might have accidentally started their journey too close to an evil Monday within its spiritual shadow. The cursed days did not just affect themselves, they seemed to contaminate the time around them. The church tried to combat these beliefs with limited success. Starting in the early medieval period, bishops and theologians made a deliberate effort to sanctify every single day of the year by dedicating each one to at least one saint. The logic was beautifully Christian. If every day belonged to a saint, every day was holy. There could be no evil days because God and his saints had claimed all days, but it did not work. The evil Monday superstition was too deeply rooted. So the church tried a different approach. They acknowledged that some days were more spiritually dangerous than others, but argued that this was precisely why Christians should rely on prayer and faith, not superstition. If you must travel on an evil Monday, pray harder. Carry a relic, trust in God's protection. This compromise satisfied almost no one. Pious Christians still avoided evil Mondays because why take the risk? And people who followed the superstition rather than Christian teaching did not need the church's permission to believe what they already believed. What makes the Evil Monday belief particularly fascinating is that it was specifically about Mondays. Not just any 3 days scattered through the year, but 3 Mondays. Why? Monday was already considered somewhat unlucky in medieval Europe because it was the moon's day, luni dies in Latin, from which Monday derives. The moon was associated with changeability, with madness, hence lunatic, with feminine cycles and tides and things that waxed and waned. The moon was not evil, but it was unpredictable, unstable. So Mondays already carried a subtle negative connotation, and certain Mondays falling at certain times of year were believed to concentrate that instability into something genuinely dangerous. The first Monday in April made sense in an agricultural society. April was when planting began in earnest across much of Europe. Starting your planting on a cursed day meant your entire harvest could be cursed. Every seed you put in the ground on an evil Monday might grow twisted, might attract blight, might yield nothing. For people whose survival depended entirely on successful crops, this was not a small fear, this was existential terror. Existential. The second Monday in August fell during the harvest time in many regions. Beginning your harvest on a cursed day might mean the grain would rot in storage, the fruit would mould, everything you worked for all year would be destroyed just as you were trying to secure it. Again, not a superstition you could casually ignore when starvation was a real possibility. And the last Monday in December fell right at the year's end, in that liminal, dangerous time between Christmas and New Year, when the old year was dying but the new year had not quite been born. Everything about that period felt unstable, and an evil Monday right in the middle of it was like a crack in the foundation of time itself. But it was not just these 3 Mondays. Oh no! Medieval people also kept track of what were called the Egyptian days, based on ancient calculations that supposedly came from Egyptian astrologers. These were additional cursed days scattered throughout the year, usually 2 per month. The exact dates varied depending on which manuscript or almanac you consulted, but the belief was consistent. Egyptian days were dangerous. Not as catastrophically dangerous as the 3 evil Mondays, perhaps, but still days when you should be cautious, when you should avoid important decisions. So a medieval person trying to plan their year had to navigate not just the 3 evil Mondays, but also 24 Egyptian days, plus all the days the church said you could not marry or feast or work, plus days of local superstition specific to their region. The calendar became a maze of restrictions. And here is the really insidious part. Because literacy rates were low, most people did not own almanacs. They relied on memory, on oral tradition, on community knowledge. But memories are fallible. Different villages remember different dates. One family's list of Egyptian days might not match another family's list. So you could follow the superstition perfectly according to what you'd been taught, and still worry that maybe, possibly, you'd gotten the dates wrong. The uncertainty was almost worse than the superstition itself. At least if you knew for certain which days were cursed, you could avoid them. But if you were not sure, then every Monday started to feel potentially dangerous. Every start of a journey, every beginning of a treatment, every new venture carried a whisper of fear. What if today is one of the cursed days and I simply do not know it? This is how superstitions metastasize. They start with specific fears, 3 evil Mondays, 24 Egyptian days, but the uncertainty around those specific fears spreads, infecting everything until you're suspicious of all Mondays, wary of all Sunzei new beginnings, hesitant to start anything at any time because you can never be completely certain it is safe. Medieval people lived with this constantly, and the psychological cost must have been enormous. Imagine needing urgent medical care but having to calculate whether today is cursed before you can receive treatment. Imagine planning a wedding and having to check multiple sources to ensure you have not accidentally scheduled it for an evil day. Imagine wanting to start a business, plant a field, begin a journey, and having to consult almanacs and priests and village elders, and even then not being entirely certain you are safe. The irony is that medieval people were trying to create certainty in an uncertain world. By identifying specific cursed days, they were attempting to map danger, to know where the pitfalls were so they could avoid them. But the mapping was inconsistent, the sources contradictory, the traditions muddled. So instead of creating certainty, the evil days belief created more uncertainty, more anxiety, more fear, and the really tragic part. The superstition persisted for centuries after the medieval period ended. In some rural areas of England, people were still consulting almanacs for evil days well into the 19th century. Queen Victoria's reign saw scientific advancement, industrial revolution, the birth of modern medicine, and also elderly people refusing to begin journeys on the first Monday in April because their grandparents had warned them it was cursed. Why did it last so long? Because it was unfalsifiable. If you avoided the evil days and nothing bad happened, the superstition worked. You stayed safe by being careful. If you ignored the evil day and nothing bad happened, well, you got lucky this time, but you should not press your luck again. And if you ignored the evil days and something bad did happen, then the superstition was proven true, and you should have listened. There was no way to disprove it, no way to test it. It was a perfect closed loop of belief that protected itself from any evidence that might undermine it. Medieval people were not stupid. They were not gullible fools believing nonsense. They were human beings trying to navigate a world where death was common, where disease struck randomly, where crop failures meant starvation, where violence could erupt without warning. The evil days superstition gave them a sense, false but comforting, that some disasters could be avoided if you were just careful enough, knowledgeable enough, pious enough. It was a coping mechanism for unbearable uncertainty, and when you understand it that way, it becomes less strange and more heartbreaking. These were people grasping for any tool that might help them survive, any belief that might offer protection. The fact that the tool did not actually work did not make the grasping less desperate or less human. But the evil days were not the only New Year superstition that seemed to promise control while delivering anxiety. Because even if you avoided the cursed days, even if you timed everything perfectly, there were still ways to accidentally destroy your year's luck. Ordinary household activities could become spiritually dangerous if performed at the wrong time, and one activity in particular, something so mundane that we barely think about it today, was believed to be absolutely catastrophic if done on New Year's Day. That simple, necessary task, and why medieval people feared it with such intensity, is where we turn next. Water. Such a simple, necessary element of life. You drink it, you cook with it, you use it to clean your body and your clothes and your home. In the modern world, we think nothing of it. We turn on a tap and water flows. We throw dirty clothes in a machine. We wash dishes without a second thought. But in medieval Europe, water on New Year's Day was dangerous. Specifically, using water to wash clothes could literally wash away a member of your family. Not metaphorically. Medieval people believed this with absolute terrified sincerity. Do laundry on New Year's Day, and someone you love will die before the year ends. This superstition was so widespread, so deeply believed, that it persisted in some communities well into the 20th century. Grandmothers in rural Scotland, Ireland, and parts of England were still warning their granddaughters in the 1950s, "Whatever you do, do not wash clothes on New Year's Day." And those granddaughters, even if they did not quite believe it, often obeyed anyway, just in case. Why? What made this particular task so spiritually dangerous? The symbolism runs deep. touching on some very primal fears about water, cleansing, and death. Let us unpack it slowly, because this is where medieval superstition reveals its strange internal logic. Reasoning that made perfect sense to them, even if it sounds bizarre to us. Water was liminal. It existed between states, neither solid nor air, flowing but containable, life-giving but also capable of drowning you. In Christian theology, water washed away sins in baptism, but it also recalled the great flood that destroyed humanity. Water was both purifying and annihilating. Washing clothes on New Year's Day, then, was not just cleaning fabric, it was using water, that powerful, dangerous substance to remove dirt and stains at the exact moment when the year was being born, when fate was being written, when the cosmic slate was supposedly being wiped clean. And medieval people feared that the water, in its cleansing action, might become confused. It might not just wash away dirt. It might wash away a person. The metaphor was visceral. Putting clothes in water and watching the water carry away stains looked disturbingly like watching something dissolve, disappear, be carried off. And if you did this on New Year's Day, the most symbolically charged day when beginnings mattered so intensely, you risked the water carrying away not just stains but souls. There was also a more practical reasoning underneath the superstition, though medieval people probably would not have articulated it this way. Laundry in the medieval period was brutal, exhausting work. You hauled heavy buckets of water, often from a well or stream, meaning you had to go outside in winter cold. You heated the water over a fire, requiring wood and labour. You scrubbed clothes by hand, a process that could take hours and left your hands raw. You wrung out heavy, sodden fabric. You hung everything to dry in weather that was often too cold for proper drying, meaning your clothes might freeze solid on the line. This was not a simple task. This was a full day of hard physical labour, usually performed by women, and medieval women were already exhausted from preparing elaborate New Year's feasts, cleaning the house, managing all the superstitious rituals we have already discussed. So there may have been an element of practical wisdom hidden in the superstition. Take a day off from the hardest household task. Rest. Do not kill yourself with work on a day that is supposed to mark a fresh start. But that practical reasoning got wrapped up in supernatural terror, and the terror became the dominant message. Do not wash clothes on New Year's Day, not because you deserve rest, but because someone will die. The specificity of the belief varied by region. In some areas of Scotland, the superstition held that washing clothes on New Year's Day would result in washing away a family member, meaning someone would die. In other areas, particularly in Ireland, the belief was that you would wash someone out of the house, meaning they would leave, move away, or become estranged from the family. Both versions were considered terrible outcomes. There are recorded instances of this superstition causing genuine family conflicts. Imagine a household where the daughter-in-law, newly married, comes from a different village with different traditions. She does not know about the laundry.
Dear friends, if this story brought you even a little peace tonight, just imagine how many more relaxing bedtime stories are waiting for you on this channel. So, please like this video, share it with someone who also loves calm stories, and don't forget to subscribe to join our family. Make sure to turn on the notification bell so you'll be the first to know whenever a new story is uploaded. And now, YouTube has introduced something new. It's called hype. By giving our channel a little hype, you can help us reach so many more people who need rest and relaxation. Your support truly means the world. Finally, let us know in the comments how tonight's story felt for you. Every single word of feedback inspires us to create more magical bedtime journeys. Sweet dreams, and see you again in the next story.